Hello. Apparently I'm live, so this should be working. If anybody will just let me know to make sure you can hear me, that'd be great, please. Um, but yeah, apologies that the camera quality is not great. I've had to use an old laptop today because I had some technical difficulties. But fingers crossed, this should go smoothly and well. So I'm Yussef Rafik. I am a zoologist and wildlife presenter, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys all about my favorite group of animals, the creepy crawlies. So they're weird, they're really unusual, they're just downright bizarre, but they are wonderful. So yeah, let's start off with defining what a creepy crawly is. So the term creepy crawly isn't actually a scientific term. It's just something we've given these animals, this group of animals that we view as small, weird, pretty freaky, and creepy, hence the name. So that could include things like insects. So with insects, you've got things like beetles, butterflies, dragonflies. It could include things like arachnids, so the spiders, tarantulas, scorpions, things like that. It could include myriapods, which are the centipedes and the millipedes. It could include mollusks, so snails and slugs, and then also isopods, which are woodlice. So there's a whole range of different animals in this group of animals that we've put all together because we think they're all weird, basically. Um, but for now, we're just going to focus on the insects. So insects are part of the group called hexapods. And hexapod is Greek. It means, well, hex means six, and pod means feet, so or foot. So essentially, they're 6 feet. And that's actually one of the rules. So there are a couple of rules that make an insect an insect. Firstly, they have to have 6 legs, hence the hexapod name. And the second rule is to do with the wings. So every insect will have 2 pairs of wings. Now, that's not quite strictly true because there are some instances where one of those pairs of wings, or both of them, have been modified into something else. So things like beetles, for example, you've got one of those pairs of wings have evolved into the hard wing case, and then the second pair of wings are underneath, which they use for flight. And then also on flies, they've modified one pair of their wings into really small little bulbous things called halteres, and they basically act as a kind of gyroscope to stabilize the fly as it's whizzing around the air and trying to get all your delicious snacks in the summer. So they're the 2 rules that make an insect an insect. So 6 legs and 2 pairs of wings, but there are instances where that can be modified. And I'll show you some examples today. So they are the just move that there. That'll come up soon. So they're the rules that make an insect an insect. Insects are they're one of the oldest animals that have been around on the planet. They first came around about 480 million years ago, which is a very long time, way before the dinosaurs, pretty much before any other animal you can imagine. Also, about 400 million years ago, they were actually the first animals to develop flight. So even before birds, insects were around, flying around the air, which must have been pretty weird at the time, because obviously there wasn't any other animals flying about, and then one of them just decided to leap into the air. That's not quite how it happened. But so that is the life story of how insects came about. And then I have got an insect here to show you. So we'll get to the good stuff now. So normally when I've done these things, I would have a live insect with me. I've had stick insects as pets, and I show those. I use those for my talks. Sadly, stick insects only live about a year, so they've all died now, which is a bit unfortunate. And as morbid as it is, I actually keep some of them in the freezer because they make great educational things, so you can actually see what they look like. So unfortunately, this is a specimen, so she is dead, but she used to be my pet. So yeah, this is a female. This is a stick insect species called they're a giant green bean stick insect, and they're called Diaphragdes gigantea, which is a Latin name. So I'll show you the reasons in a second why I know this is a female. But yeah, that's her, and she's pretty big. She's not the biggest stick insect in the world. There's a type of stick insect called a jungle nymph, which are really chunky. They're the heaviest stick insect in the world. But these are pretty close behind. But if you think this is a big insect, you should get in a time machine and hop back 300 million years back to the Carboniferous period, when there were insects and bugs in general that were giants. And this was due to there being a much higher concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere, which allowed them to grow to this size. Oh, I think we've got a question here from Paul on Instagram messages. What is my favorite insect that I've seen in the wild? Oh, that's a very good question, Paul. I've seen in the wild. So I think it's quite a basic one, but I think it's actually the common blue damselflies, which are very common, hence their name. And you see them all around in summer, but they're just so pretty. They're that electric blue color. And there's a really cool fact I like about them. When the females lay their eggs underwater, when they're laying the eggs underwater, it can be really straining. It takes up a lot of energy. So they actually don't have energy to re-emerge out of the water, so they can drown. So what happens is the male damselflies will dive deep down into the water, pull out the females, and save their lives. So yeah, I like common blue damselflies. But don't forget, thanks for that question, Paul. And don't forget, if any of you listening have any other questions, just whack them on here. But yeah, so as I was saying, what was I saying? The giant bugs. So 300 million years ago, there were some giant bugs around, and I do mean giant. There were 8-foot long millipedes. There were dragonflies the size of seagulls. There were cockroaches the size of cocker spaniels. They were massive. So yeah, if you think this girl is big, you should travel back in time. But I bet a lot of us are quite thankful we don't live in those days anymore. So I will now show you how I know that this stick insect is a female. So what this species, the giant green bean stick insect, has is something called sexual dimorphism. Now, sexual dimorphism is essentially, all that means is there's a difference in appearance between male and female. So if we want to think of an everyday example that you see all the time, think about mallards, the ducks. So females are sort of this brown color, and the males have that beautiful green iridescent type head. Well, in stick insects, there's still sexual dimorphism, but it's a bit different. So this is a female, and this is a male. They're both fully grown. This is as big as they get, but as you can see, the male is a lot smaller. They're brown. That's another big difference. And they have those really long wings that run the entire length of their bodies. So the males are able to fly, but the females, you might look at the female and think, well, she hasn't got any wings, but she does. She actually has these 2 pairs of really small wings just there. Obviously, they're rather puny, so she can't really fly. So females can't fly, but they don't need to. They don't want to put their energy into flight. They want to put all their energy into developing eggs because they just want to pass on the genes to the next generation. And speaking about eggs, we will now look at some eggs. So yeah, that's the male and that's the female. So let's talk about stick insect reproduction. In a lot of species of stick insect, they do normal sexual reproduction. In this species and a few others, so the females can essentially clone themselves, so they don't need a male to reproduce. So what happens is they, like I say, they clone themselves, so they lay eggs, and because all that genetic information of the baby is 100% from their mother, so they're only getting genetic information from one parent because they only have one parent. That means they're exactly the same. They will come out looking exactly the same. So yeah, they're clones. But now we're going to have a look at some of these eggs. Now, I don't know how well this is going to get picked up on here. So they're the eggs. While you're looking at those eggs, I'll just answer the question that's just popped up. So, Yussef, are there any species you would really love to see or learn more about? Another brilliant question. I think so. There's a species called a vinegaroon, which I believe is an African species. And essentially, they're a type of arachnid, so they're related to spiders and scorpions, and they have this kind of looks like a whip tail, and they can spray acetic acid out of their bums, basically. Acetic acid is vinegar, so essentially they're spraying really, really concentrated vinegar, and they use that as a defense mechanism to scare away all the predators. And if they get it in the eyes, obviously it's quite painful. I wouldn't want to get sprayed in the face by vinegar, so a lot of predators wouldn't. So I'd really love to go see them in the wild. Also, I was lucky enough to actually see some giant African millipedes in Africa. That was a pretty cool experience. But I'd love to see some more millipede species because they're they're pretty weird as as far as animal goes, with all those legs. Another animal I'd love to see is the Goliath bird-eating spider. I'm not a huge fan of spiders, but I'm getting there, and I do actually have some spider-related material to show you in just a second. But let's go back to the eggs. So these are stick insect eggs. As you can see, they're pretty, well, they're small. They're not small for an insect. You might be surprised at how big they are compared to a lot of insect eggs, but they're certainly no chicken egg. And they're quite brown, they're quite boring, but this is actually all a very clever method from the stick insect because they're camouflaged to look exactly like seeds. Now, it's a bit weird that an animal would want their eggs to look like a food item to many predators or many animals. So, not eggs, seeds. Sorry, seeds are obviously edible and get eaten by a lot of animals. So, why in the world would a stick insect want its eggs to look like a food item? Well, there's a couple of theories for this, and science isn't 100% sure on either of them. The first theory is that birds will actually come along, think these eggs are a seed, they will pick up that seed, they'll swallow it, it will sit in their digestive tract, and the bird will fly away and it will poo out the seed somewhere else. So this is all a method of genetic dispersal. So rather than the stick insect just laying the egg where it lays it and all the babies sort of stay in a small group, this is a way of dispersing their offspring through further afield by the birds flying away and pooing out the egg miles away. There's been a couple of studies looking into this, and they're sort of for and against it. So one study looked into this process by essentially feeding stick insect eggs to some quails, and that was found that the eggs couldn't actually survive the digestive tract of the quails, and they didn't hatch. So that kind of made it look like the theory wasn't really right. But there have been other studies that have shown that they do in fact survive the digestive tract of some birds. So it all depends a lot on the bird species and the stick insect species. So that's one theory. But the second theory, which I personally think might be a little bit more reliable, is essentially the eggs themselves. You probably won't be able to see it because it's not a great camera, but the eggs themselves have a little sort of cap on top that's full of fat. And there's an animal that loves this, and they are ants. So ants will come along, they'll pick up the egg, they will carry it back to their nest, thinking it's a seed. They'll carry it back to their nest, and in the nest, because it's under a layer of soil, the egg will be kept nice and warm, and it'll also be kept protected from predators such as parasitic wasps. And then the egg will hatch, and the baby will emerge out of the nest and be absolutely fine. So they are the two theories about stick insect eggs and why they look like seeds, which is pretty cool. Right, now we're going to move on. We're going to look at something else, some other weird and wonderful thing about stick insects, and that is how they grow. So I'll just get my little props ready to show you in a second. So us humans grow gradually. So, you know, when we're born, we're really small, and then gradually throughout our lives, we get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's the same for all vertebrates. So mammals like us, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. But invertebrates are a little bit different. So invertebrates like insects, and insects in particular, go through a process where they grow in what's called instars. So rather than growing gradually, they grow in stages. So every so often, they will molt their entire exoskeleton. And exoskeleton is the name we give to essentially their skin, but it's not really their skin, it's their exoskeleton. So we have a skeleton inside us, we have an internal skeleton. Insects don't have this, they have an external skeleton, an exoskeleton. So basically this hard casing. And every so often they will break out of the exoskeleton and re-emerge a lot bigger. So they grow in a way that's not gradual, it's sort of stages. But I'll show you this to you to make it more obvious. So this, I don't know if you'll be able to pick this up, it's very small, but that is the molt, so the exoskeleton of a stick insect. This stick insect species that I just showed you, that was once that size. But over time, they get bigger and bigger, and their molts get bigger as well. So it goes, I mean, there's a few stages between this, but it goes from that size to that size and gradually gets bigger and bigger, and over time it gets fully grown. Now, it depends on the species how many of these instars they go through. Things like crickets typically go through about 6 instars in their life. And then once they've gone through the last one, they're fully grown. Stick insects like this species go through about 8 or 9 instars. So that's how they grow. But insects aren't the only ones to shed their entire exoskeleton. pretty much, as far as I'm aware, all arthropods do. So that also includes things like arachnids, so tarantulas. And to show this, I've got some tarantula molts. So I'm just trying to do it so you don't get the reflection. So right here, we've got a Mexican red rump tarantula. And although this looks like a dead tarantula, it's actually not. This is just its exoskeleton. So what happens is, if you can see that round thing on top there, on the thorax, that's known as a carapace. And that will just pop open and the tarantula will sort of pull itself out of this exoskeleton. It's really weird. You should totally YouTube it if you have the opportunity, because it's a weird thing to watch. Um, Basically, what happens is when it comes out, it'll be really, really soft because it takes a little bit of time for the new exoskeleton to harden. So that means it's super vulnerable to predators. So for a while afterwards, the tarantula will have to go and hide to make sure it doesn't get eaten because it will have a really soft body. And then over here, that's just some fangs. But over here, you can actually see a Thailand black tarantula without its carapace. So you can see all the little leg holes where it's pulled out all of its new legs. And also, I don't know if you can see these little white things. These are called book lungs, and book lungs are how tarantulas breathe. So they don't breathe with normal lungs like we do. They breathe out of these. And insects also have a weird way of breathing. So oh, they got a bit tangled up here. But so they don't have lungs either. And instead of having lungs, they have things called spiracles that run the entire, well, sort of length of their body. You won't be able to see them because they're really small holes. But basically, what happens is oxygen will go in these holes. It will pass through really small tubes in the body called tracheal tubes, and then the oxygen will diffuse out of these tubes, and into the cells of the body. So that is how they breathe. Oh, we've got another question here. Can you tell us more about your show Bugface on BBC Air? Okay, cool. So Bugface, as I said before, I'm a wildlife presenter, and one of the shows I've done is called Bugface. And this is on, if you want to check it out, it's on YouTube. It's on BBC Earth Kids. It's actually pretty good for around this sort of time if you want. It's quite educational. So if you want your kids to learn stuff about bugs, go check it out. But essentially, what the show is all about, is I'm joined by celebrity guests. So every episode we have a different celebrity guest, and then we're also joined by some weird and wonderful bug from around the world. We've had all sorts of things on, and essentially, I'm sure you can guess from the name Bugface, but we get the guests to recline in a chair, and then I stick the bug on their face and record their reactions. So it's pretty entertaining. There's a lot of screaming involved. But also it is quite educational. When the guests are laying down, they have a screen to read, so they're reading out facts. I talk about facts about the bugs. So you might learn a thing or two about different bugs. We've had all sorts of stick insect species. We've had the vinegaroon, like I was talking about before. We've had tailless whip scorpions, giant cockroaches, all sorts. So yeah, that's Bugface. Hopefully that answers your question well enough. Are there any other questions out there? Because if not, I'm just going to sort of ad lib about bugs for a bit. But yeah, as I was saying before about their breathing, so that's how they breathe. So insects have spiracles, so they don't have lungs like we do. Also on the subject of, another question. A great question from Twitter. Do you have any tips for when you're out and about, how you ID insects? Okay, so this is a great question as well. Firstly, IDing insects down to the species level in a lot of cases is really, really difficult. There are people who can do it, and some insects are easier to ID than others. What are really useful if you've got an insect identification guide. I don't think I've got mine up here, but I do have one. And basically, it's got a key in it. So if you find an insect and you want to know what it is, you can follow this key. I don't know of any specific books. I'll try and find a link, and if Lizzie will let me put it in the description below. Once this video is finished, you can follow along and find an actual guide. Basically, they have a key, and then so if you found an insect, let's say it's a type of beetle and you don't know what it is, you can follow this key and you can say, right, it's black. So you go down the black section and then you follow it down, and hopefully that helps to identify the insect. Sometimes it's impossible to identify it down to the species level, but you can identify most of them down to about the genus or order at least. So yeah, hopefully that's that. So books are helpful. Other tips. Also, it sounds a bit childish, but if you've got a magnifying glass, take that out with you. Helps you get closer up to those bugs, because some of them are obviously really small and you can't always see. Is especially if you're using a key, you can't always see all the body parts. So yeah, hopefully that's useful. You know, it would be useful if it was still in the Carboniferous period and bugs were about that big. They'd be really easy to ID. Cold bite, hi. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. On the subject of insects, though, I forgot to mention, we always think of insects as a pretty weird group of animals, right? I mean, you're not going to be able to see her face very close up, but you kind of can. She looks very alien-like. She's very weird. But actually, there's what we know of. There's 1 million, roughly. There's about 1 million species of insect that we know of that science has discovered. Um, they estimate that the actual figure is closer to about 10 million. So there's a lot of insects that we haven't even discovered yet. And that means that out of all the animals in the world, all of the animals, 90% roughly, are insects. So although we think of them as weird, technically we're in the minority. So technically we're the weirdos and they're normal. But yeah, are there any more questions before we wrap this up? What else could I tell you about insects? So, I mean, as I was saying before, they've all got 6 legs. We could talk about their mouth parts. So the mouth parts are really weird as well, because obviously we have mouths with teeth, and these insects don't. Now, different insects have different types of mouth parts. So because stick insects, they are herbivores, so they eat leaf matter. So these guys quite like bramble when they're alive. So they have mandibles, and again, you probably won't be able to quite see. But under there, they have mandibles, which are really sharp blades that they essentially use as kind of like shears to scrape away at that leaf, and they swallow it, and it goes into that digestive tract, and then they poo it out like any other animal. But like I said, there are some other different mouth parts. So there's there's another type of mouth part that's essentially a sucking tube. So things like butterflies. If you look at a butterfly really close up, you might notice that it doesn't have any teeth, obviously, or mandibles. Instead, it has this it's a thing that sort of twirls around like that, and that's a sucking mouth part. So what it does, it'll extend that, it will put it into whatever it's sucking up, so whether it be plant sap or whatever. That's very scientific. So put it into it'll drink that nectar. Nectar, that's the word I'm looking for. It'll drink the nectar. It will suck up the nectar through that sucking mouth part, which essentially acts like a tube or a straw. So they're the different mouth parts. Another cool thing about insects, a lot of them have compound eyes. So they don't have eyes like we do. Instead, they have thousands and thousands of lenses that make up a single eye, and that's called a compound eye. So if you imagine things like dragonflies that have these huge, big, bulbous eyes on the top of their heads, they're made up of loads of little lenses that they can see essentially. So that their vision isn't as good as ours is, but those compound eyes allow them to see uh, pretty much, I think, 360 degrees. I'll have to double check that fact, but as far as I'm aware, they can see very close behind their heads, and that's obviously a predator detection tool, so they can see if any predators are coming. Can you tell us more about families insects are classified into? Sure. So there's a few different ways, well, a few different classifications of insects. So the whole kingdom, phylum, class, order, uh, family, genus, species. That's the order down it goes. So if we're talking about families, there's a few different families. So there are the beetles, which are some of the most numerous insects in the world. They're called Coleoptera, and they're obviously quite easy to identify because they look like beetles. So they roughly all look about the same. They're well, I was going to say they're small, but some of them are quite big. But they have that shell, and you can always sort of identify it. Beetle. But then there are the Lepidoptera, which includes things like butterflies and moths. There are the Orthodonta, which are the dragonflies and damselflies. What else? There's the Hymenoptera, which are, funnily enough, they are the insects that are eusocial. So eusocial means there's lots of them living together. So think things like bees that live in hives. Think about wasps, ants. They are all part of the Hymenoptera. And then there's I can never pronounce this one. Hemiptera or something. That's the flies. So the fly species. But on the subject of eusociality, that's an actually really interesting point. We can better wrap this up soon because it's getting on. We can talk about that quickly. So eusociality means they live in these mega societies, basically. So if you think about ants, they can live in communities of thousands, and they each have an individual role. So there are worker ants, there are the queen ants, and the same thing with bees. So there are the queen ants, so there are worker bees, the drones. But there are also bee species that are not eusocial. There are solitary bees, and they're actually, not many people know this, but a lot of solitary bees are better pollinators than honeybees and bumblebees. So things like mason bees, and leafcutter bees. It's always good if you can to put a bug hotel or something in your garden. Think about tubes of bamboo to allow these bees to nest, and also obviously if you've got plants that allows them to pollinate. So hopefully that's answered all of your questions. Are there any other questions before we wrap this up? I'll just check that I've actually done them all. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this live. Hope you've learned something. Don't forget, next week there'll be another Earth Live lesson. I think on Wednesday. You'll have to double check that with Lizzie. But I just want to say thank you very much to Lizzie for allowing me to come on here and nerd out about bugs. Yeah, if that's all, we'll wrap this up. But thank you for watching, and see you soon. Bye.